All right, so imagine you're sailing across this huge ocean of the Pacific, and you finally land on this like lush island paradise. And then you meet all these people from a totally different culture and they just don't get you, like at all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like something out of a book, right?
Totally. But this is a true story. The story of Captain Cook in Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
And get this, it kind of sets the stage for what we're diving into today, a super important time in American history. We're talking about the rise of American imperialism.
You know, it's funny. This period, the late 1800s and early 1900s, people don't always think about it a lot, but it's really important.
Yeah, we don't really get the full story in school, do we?
No, not really, but it's crucial if you want to understand America's place, in the world, like how we got to where we are.
Exactly. And we're going to be looking at a really cool podcast called History That Doesn't Suck. And they had this awesome discussion where they went through like feedback from listeners.
Oh.
And they really dug into how a war that was supposed to be about fighting imperialism actually ended up helping to build an American empire.
Yeah, I mean, the Spanish-American War, everyone always thinks about the Maine, right?
Right, the sinking of the USS Maine.
Yeah, but the podcast, they really emphasize that you can't just look at that one event. This was like decades in the making, The U.S. had been involved in Cuba and the Caribbean for a long time.
Like things had been heating up for years, and then boom.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't forget about the media. Like, think about William Randolph Hearst and his yellow journalism, all those crazy headlines.
Sensationalizing.
Yeah, it was a huge influence on how people saw things.
Kind of scary how similar it is to today, right? All that talk about fake news and how media can manipulate stuff.
Yeah.
They even talk about this one headline, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Like, wow.
That's intense.
Right. But the thing is, they point out that there was never any proof that Spain was actually behind it. So it really makes you think about how media can, shape what people believe, even if there's no real evidence.
Yeah, and all that frenzy, it really got people fired up for war.
And then the war just like explodes, right? Like suddenly we're fighting in the Philippines too against the Spanish. We're already on their way out anyway.
Well, the podcast, they argue that this move into the Philippines, it was driven by like money. They wanted to trade with China.
So it wasn't just about helping Cuba anymore.
Right. It was about getting a foothold in the Pacific and all those potential markets.
So economic interests shaping foreign policy.
Exactly. They saw the Philippines as like a stepping stone to China, a way to become a major player on the world stage.
Okay, so let's talk about Hawaii for a minute, because this is a really good example of how tricky it can be to understand history.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There are always different sides to the story.
Absolutely. The podcast, they tell the story about General Antonio Luna, remember him, the Filipino general who died in the Philippine-American War.
Oh, yeah, vaguely.
So they wanted to get the details of his death right, but they couldn't find the information anywhere. It was like super hard to track down.
So what did they do?
They had to search for ages, and finally they found this rare book with the actual account. They even had listeners offering to help them find it.
Wow, that's dedication.
Yeah, it shows how committed they are to getting it right. And it really connects to what they say about Captain Cook's death in Hawaii. Like, even if you have people who saw something happen, their stories can be unreliable,
Well, for sure. Like biases and time and all that, it can really change things.
Exactly. So you can't just take one person's word for it. You got to look at everything and think critically.
It's like a puzzle, trying to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, but some of the pieces are missing and some have changed shape over time.
Okay, so how do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, you got to remember that history, it's not just a bunch of facts set in stone. It's about interpreting what happened. It's always evolving.
So it's like a conversation, right, between the past and the present.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. We're always learning new things, challenging old ideas.
Oh, wait, we should be questioning things, comparing different accounts, like doing our own detective work.
Yes, and that's what the podcast really encourages. Don't just accept what you hear, dig deeper.
Love that. All right, so speaking of debates, the 1900 election, this was when American imperialism became like the issue. We had McKinley, who was all about expansion, and Bryan, who was totally against it.
It was a huge showdown.
For real. Now, Bryan, he was super against imperialism, but he's also really focused on this idea of using silver as money.
Yeah, he was known for that.
And it makes you wonder, did that focus on silver, even though it was important, kind of distract from his message about imperialism?
That's a great question. Some people say that Bryan couldn't let go of this silver thing and it might have cost him the election.
Interesting. It shows how complicated politics can be. Like, sometimes one issue can take over everything else.
Yeah, messaging is super important, knowing what to focus on.
Totally.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt, he seemed to get that. He was like McKinley's vice president, but he was already this big personality, super charismatic.
Oh, yeah, they compared him to Lincoln in the podcast. They said he was just as good at connecting with people.
So he wasn't just like a boring politician,
Oh,
right?
wait, he was a war hero. He led the charge up Kettle Hill, not San Juan Hill like people think, during the Spanish-American War.
Wow. So he was a man of action.
Totally. And it was almost like he was born for this moment in history, you know?
Like destiny calling.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe he was just really ambitious and knew what he wanted.
Right. And when the time came, he was ready to take charge.
Absolutely. He stepped into the spotlight and never looked back.
All right. So we're back diving deep into American imperialism.
Last time, we were talking about, all the things that kind of set the stage for the Spanish-American War
Right.
and how that war, even though it wasn't supposed to, ended up making America into an empire. Yeah, and we were talking about like how you can't always trust historical sources, especially when they say totally different things.
It's like being a detective, right? You got to figure out the truth.
Exactly. So now let's talk about some of the big names, the people who really made this era what it was. And we got to start with Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Oh, for sure.
The History That Doesn't Suck podcast, they really get his personality across. Like, he was larger than life, you know?
He had that energy, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. They compare him to Lincoln, like how good he was at connecting with people, making them feel like he was one of them.
But he wasn't just all talk, was he?
No, not at all. He was all about action, a real war hero. He led the charge up Kettle Hill, not San Juan Hill, like a lot of people think.
During the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, that's the one.
It seems like he would have been a big deal no matter when he lived. But it's almost like he was meant for this time in American history, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like his drive, his ambition, it was the same as America's, you know? They both wanted to be powerful on the world stage.
Makes sense. And speaking of ambition, there was William Jennings Bryan, his opponent in that 1900 election. I heard he was an incredible speaker.
Amazing, totally captivating. They called him the Great Commoner.
Wow, that's quite a title.
I know, right? And his Cross of Gold speech, it's famous, all about using silver and gold as money, bimetallism.
Right. But they also said he was a little bit stuck in his ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. He was totally against imperialism, but he just couldn't let go of that silver thing, even when most people weren't that worried about it anymore.
So it's like he was fighting a battle that was already over, while Roosevelt was looking ahead to the future.
Exactly. And it kind of shows how being a politician, it's not just about what you believe in, it's about how you get your message across and picking your battles, I guess.
Because in Bryan's case, his focus on silver might have actually hurt his message about imperialism, which was arguably more important for the country at the time.
You got it. And Roosevelt, he knew how to play the game, He knew that America had to change to stay powerful, and he could explain that to people, make them excited about it.
So he was the right president for the time, like you were saying.
I think so, definitely. He had this energy that people loved, and he made them believe that America could do anything.
That's pretty inspiring. But let's not forget, there was a dark side to all this, right? America taking over places like the Philippines and Hawaii. It wasn't all good.
No, for sure. And the podcast, they talk about how the people who lived in those places, their lives were changed forever and not always for the better.
Yeah, we can't forget about them.
Exactly. They say we need to understand what it was like for them, how they resisted or tried to adapt, and how all of that still affects the world today.
Okay, so let's talk about the Philippines. We talked about how America took over after the Spanish-American War, but what happened then?
Well, it wasn't easy, that's for sure. The
Yeah.
Filipinos, they had been fighting for freedom from Spain, and they didn't want America to just take over, so they fought back.
And that was the Philippine-American War, right?
Yeah, and it was a really bad one. Lots of fighting and death on both sides.
And it's a war that we don't really talk about much in school.
It's true. But it left a lot of damage, bad feelings between the Philippines and America that lasted for a long time.
Yeah, it makes you think trying to build an empire, even if you think you're doing good, can really hurt people.
For sure. And it can cause problems for generations. Okay, so let's switch to Hawaii for a minute. We talked about how the takeover was supposed to be peaceful, but we know that wasn't really true.
Right, it was more complicated than that.
Way more. They overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and put in a government that America liked, and that was a big deal, really controversial. Even today, people are still debating about it.
Wow, so it was all about politics and money and silencing the people who already lived there.
Yeah, and it really makes you question if America had the right to do what they did. and what the long-term effects of colonialism really are.
It's like history is often told by the winners, right?
Totally. But we got to look closer, question what we're told, and listen to the voices that don't get heard as much.
We have to be willing to challenge the stories we've always believed, right?
That's what makes history so interesting. It's about asking questions, searching for the truth, and being open to changing our minds when we learn something new.
I like that. Okay, so earlier you said something about calling stations. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah. So back then, having a strong navy was super important, right? And those ships, they needed places to stop and get fuel and supplies, like gas stations for the ocean.
So that's what calling stations were.
Exactly. Places like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and some ports in the Philippines, they all became really important for America to show its power around the world.
So it wasn't just about taking land. It was about controlling these key spots that helped them run their empire.
Right, they needed those strategic locations to be a major player.
So it's like a big puzzle, right? We got to see how all these different territories fit together, how they helped America become so powerful.
And remember, those places on the map, they're not just dots. They represent real people whose lives were changed by all this.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the next part and talk about what happened because of American imperialism, how it affected different places, and what it means for us today.
Because those effects, they're still with us, shaping how countries interact, how we see ourselves, and the problems we face as a global community.
Welcome back to our deep dive. It's been quite a journey, right?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot.
We started with, like, what led up to the Spanish-American War.
Right.
And then, those big personalities like Theodore Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan.
Yeah, really shaping things.
And we saw how America became this global power. But wasn't all sunshine and roses, right?
No, definitely not.
There were some serious consequences.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're going to dig into now.
Yeah.
How American imperialism actually affected different places.
Yeah, and the ripple effects, they're still felt today.
It's like this idea of empire, it wasn't just about lines on a map, right?
No way, it was about people.
Real people whose lives were completely changed.
Sometimes for the better, sometimes not.
The podcast, History That Doesn't Suck, they do a good job of showing those personal stories,
Yeah, they make it real.
They point out that those people living in those territories, their voices often get lost in the big story of empire building.
It's easy to forget about them.
Yeah, but it's so important to hear those different perspectives.
Absolutely. To see how imperialism actually played out.
Right, like how people resisted or how they adapted and how it all still matters today.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with the Philippines. We talked about how America took them over after the Spanish-American War.
Right, but it wasn't a happy ending.
No, it wasn't like, okay, we're in charge now, everyone be cool.
Definitely not.
What happened?
Well, the Filipinos, they had been fighting for freedom from Spain, remember?
Hmm?
And they didn't just want to trade one ruler for another.
So they fought back.
They did, and it turned into this whole other war, the Philippine-American War.
That's one we don't hear much about.
Yeah, it was really brutal. A lot of people died on both sides.
And it's like this forgotten part of American history.
It is, and it really left its mark,
Oh, yeah.
A lot of bad blood between the Philippines and the U.S.
It's a reminder that empire building, even if you think you're doing the right thing, it can have a really dark side.
For sure, and those scars, they can last for a long time.
Okay, so let's talk about Hawaii. We talked about how it was supposed to be this peaceful annexation.
Right, but we know it wasn't that simple.
No, not at all. What really happened?
They overthrew Queen Liliuokalani,
Wow.
and they put in a government that was pro-America.
So it was all about power and money and silencing the Hawaiians.
Exactly. And it's still a big deal today.
People are still arguing about it.
Absolutely. It makes you question, if America even had the right to do that.
And the whole idea of colonialism, what it really means.
It's complicated.
It's like history's written by the winners, right?
A lot of times, yeah.
So we have to be
We
careful.
afford to question everything.
Look for those voices that don't always get heard.
Exactly. And be open to changing our minds about the past.
So as we think about American imperialism, what can we learn from all this?
Well, one thing is that trying to build an empire, it always has consequences.
Even if you think you're doing good.
Right. And those consequences, they can be bad, really bad, and last for a long time.
We also see that history isn't just facts in a book.
It's alive, it's changing.
It's all about how we interpret it.
Exactly. And our perspective, our values, they all shape how we see the past.
And those stories we tell ourselves, they're powerful.
They shape who we are, where we come from,
So we got to be aware of the different stories out there.
And be critical and be willing to learn new things.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I got to say, this has been eye-opening.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
It's made me question some things I thought I knew about American history.
And that's a good thing.
It is. It helps us understand the world better,
And be better citizens.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep questioning, keep exploring.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into American imperialism. We hope you learned something new and maybe even see the world a little differently now.
And until next time, keep on diving deep into history.